the family of Marianne Orlando and all the friends here today. We want to say welcome. I know that Marianne would be utterly pleased to see all of these beautiful faces around this room. So, lest you don't know me, my name is Mary Jo Bona. I am one of my Aunt Marianne's nieces. The other nieces are here today, my sister Carmen Bona, my wife Judy Fenninger, and the nephew Mark, whom I will reintroduce when he appears. I first met Marianne in Paris when she was working at the embassy there, when my late father, Max Krauss, introduced the glamorous career woman to a very shy teenager. I thought she epitomized everything I wanted to be when I grew up. I loved listening to her stories from her Peace Corps days, and in later years, loved tagging along when she, Pat, and my dad would go on their explorations of 3-star restaurants in France, which always entailed interesting and lively conversation. Are you remembering this, Pat? Fortunately for me, she decided to adopt me as a friend, and we have kept in touch over these many years. Getting together with her was always delightful, and our phone chats were always such fun. I'm so glad I saw her in March. She was truly one of a kind. In a lucky, life-changing break, I was hired by Sarge to be his speechwriter, which meant I had plenty of visits with Marianne, waiting in the office to get a few minutes with Sarge. Happily so, she was always gracious despite all the pressures that kept coming in as funds for the war on poverty were decreasing, while those for the Vietnam War were increasing. It was just a while back that I ran into Marianne at a Whole Foods store. Her thoughts, see this food issue, typically were other-centered, not self-centered, reminding me to send a birthday card to Charlie Peters, one of her longtime friends from the Peace Corps days. And so he raises a glass, not of wine, but of water, to Marianne Orlando, yours, Coleman McCarthy. We at the National Bonsai Foundation mourn the passing of Marianne Orlando. We received many responses to her unexpected death, and here are some of those that were sent from members of the MBF Board of Directors. The first, Marianne was the most elegant of women. With talent, charm, and ferocious drive, she fought for NBF and accomplished much. She was admired for her fortitude. The second, I deeply regret the loss of Marianne. We are all the better for having known her. And then finally, I am so sorry to hear of Marianne's passing. We worked closely together on my earliest donations to the museum, and she facilitated introducing me to the greats of bonsai, including John Naka and, I believe, Yuji Yoshimura, in lovely receptions and dinners. We are grateful to her for her stellar contributions to the art of bonsai, and we know for certain that her spirit will live on in the National Bonsai and Penjing Museum. When I first arrived at Sergeant Shriver's door as his special assistant in 1967, I met the beautiful Marianne Orlando, who guarded the entry to Mr. Shriver's office with great loyalty and determination. Once you were befriended by Marianne, everything else was downhill from then on, and I enjoyed my 18 months working with Sarge as his special assistant tremendously. She is smiling on us from above and may be arguing with Sarge over his latest schedule. Best wishes, Donald Dell. Dear friends of Marianne, many things came together to create the wonder of Peace Corps. The president who created it, the man he chose to lead it, the people who came to form an organization like no other, the young people who responded to its call, and a young woman who was the spark and sustenance behind everything, Marianne Orlando. Like the extraordinary work she did in helping with President Kennedy's funeral, all behind the scenes, like the support she gave to staff and volunteers who sat outside Sarge's office waiting to talk to him about problems, like her unflappable calm when the chaos outside of Sarge's office had even a psychiatrist worried, and on a more personal note, when she was helping our ambassador to Paris, Sarge, And when he invited us to spend the last week on our honeymoon in Paris, how could we refuse? One of the best parts of our experience was when Marianne took us out on the town. You may not have known what a fun-loving girl she was. Anne and I would like to join you in a toast to our Peace Corps star, who is now a star in the heavens, preparing a special place there for all who fell in love with Peace Corps and hope to join her there. We met exactly 49 years ago last month in Paris, so it is appropriate that I write these lines from France. Sarge brought 4 people with him to get him launched on one of the most memorable tours any American ambassador has ever had in France. But Marianne was the one who knew the Shrivers the best. Indeed, the entire Kennedy family going back to Father Joseph Kennedy, and she was our reference point and guide. I was a junior officer just starting in my career, but I was informed and impressed by her quiet intelligence, her grace, her ability subtly to manage not only a State Department bureaucracy that was new to her, but a very boisterous young Shriver family.
I'm sad, devastated by Marianne's death. More than she ever knew, she was a big part of my evolution as a social worker and public office holder. She and Sarge were, to me, inseparable, this very best of the new American century. Marianne was both tough and always right. She and Sarge were the dream team of the Peace Corps, Vista, and the 60s and 70s. I rarely saw her in recent years, but she was always a part of me. God bless Marianne Orlando. The Marianne I knew when we worked together at the Peace Corps was a gifted gatekeeper, tough but fair, as she made sure that Sarge heard from his subordinates everything that would help him do a better job, and as little as possible of self-promoting attempts to impress or curry favor with the boss. But I also knew another Marianne, the kind friend who took in my wife in our early days in Washington when we did not yet have a home and I was away visiting projects overseas. She and Beth became lifelong pals. And when my son was born in 1963, she became his unofficial godmother. There's a lovely photograph of her holding a week-old Chris. I wish you could see the tender look on her face, and you would never doubt there was another side to that tough Marianne we saw in the office. Through all the subsequent years, she and her friend Pat Woodward shared Thanksgiving and Christmas with us, our son, his wife, and our grandchildren. Marianne was part of our family and always will be.
I first met Marianne in 1963. 1 year after I moved to Washington from California. Angie Novello, I'm sure many people know that name, Bobby Kennedy's closest confidant, introduced us and we hit it off immediately. We were about the same age, and by 1964 we became each other's best friends and have remained that to this day, mainly because we shared the same interests in tastes in people, food, travel, culture, politics, everything. For instance, we often bought the same clothes or shoes, forcing us to have to check with each other if we were going somewhere together. At restaurants, we would inevitably order the same thing. She had 3 sisters and always referred to me as her 4th. I only had a brother, so she was my sister. Because of our demeanor in public, strangers would often ask if we were sisters. Also, we fought all the time, as sisters tend to do. I miss her terribly. It will be very difficult to face life without her. Au revoir, my dear friend, my sister, Pat.
So it's really quite wonderful that Pat referred to Angie, because there were these, extraordinarily capable 3 women, Angelique, who worked for Ted, and Angie Novella, who worked for RFK, and Marianne. And once, when I was relatively new in Washington and living in that little 9-foot wide house in Snow's Court, the three of them just knocked on the door and walked in some Saturday or Sunday afternoon, each more beautiful than the other and dressed to the T's, as they always were. And I hope you understand that Marianne took care of Angie through Angie's long, long dementia. That was the kind of person Marianne was. And she and I, were extraordinarily close for the whole time that I knew her. I have to say that while all of you have talked about her elegance and her beauty and her intelligence, all of which is true, it's also true that she was the most self-effacing, selfless, extraordinarily well-defended person that I ever met, as well as being extremely trustworthy and discreet. I'm sorry that Charlie isn't here, Beth, because he might remember this.
You're going to hear from Charlie.
Okay, but you probably don't know that sometime in the late 60s, Charlie said to me, "You know, Bill, if you were smart, you'd really marry Marianne." Now, that was a prescient comment, but boy, would that ever have been a project.
First met Marianne and Pat Woodward in the late 1980s. Can you hear me? Okay. Through my dear friend Hildy Shishkin. Hildy, a top aide to Averil Harriman, and Marianne, a top assistant to Sergeant Shriver, shared a pied-à-terre when Ambassador Shriver was ambassador to France and Harriman was chief negotiator for the Vietnam peace talks in Paris. Pat later joined the duo, and they became a fearsome trio. They were a joy to me. I had served in the Foreign Service for more than 20 years at that time. Most of those years during Republican administrations. And here, like gold in my lap, sat three die-hard Democrats who also were very cognizant of international affairs and the operations of the Department of State and USIA. Hildy was the more reflective. Pat, media savvy and always ready with a quip. And Marianne absolutely focused on the problem at hand. They were all amazing. They had a zest for life and would meet challenges head-on without shrinking. Best friends, Marianne and Pat, traveled Europe and the United States together, played tennis, sampled the best restaurants, and loved beauty. I especially recall their yearly sojourns to Cape Cod, where they rented first a lovely cottage in Dennisport, and later a charming house closer to me in Harwich. Walks on the beach, eating the treasures from the sea, which they would turn out, in particular their wonderful lobster fests, attending summer theater. It was great fun. Marianne was pristine in appearance. Pat, a shade more sporty. Not spotty. Not spotty, sporty. White starched shirt over which was draped a lovely sweater, hair perfectly coiffed. My conversations with Marianne and Pat followed a pattern. Discussion of the political problems confronting us. In the last few months, that portion of the conversation grew longer and longer. Movies we had seen, books we had read, projects we were engaged in, and finally, agreement, especially with Marianne, that most of our political problems were the result of the fact that civics were no longer taught in school. An example of Mary Ann's success in what she engaged in was evident in her work for the Chinese Penjing Museum. That is the equivalent of the Japanese bonsai at the National Arboretum. She was just starting on the project and did not know anyone in the Chinese community. I introduced her to Mary Meads, the wife of former Congressman from Washington State, Lloyd Meads. Mary, Chinese American, knew everyone in the Chinese community and introduced Mary Ann to one of the leaders of the Chinese community, who in turn introduced her to the Chinese ambassador. In the twinkling of an eye, the ambassador organized a reception on behalf of the Beijing exhibit. And Mary Ann was able to raise enough money for the museum to be built. It's a handsome place.
So I grew up with strong women in my life. Yeah, really strong women. Zeus-like strength, if we can put it that way. And I also grew up with a dad who loved to use people's full name. If you'd said to me, Mary Ann, I would not have known who you were talking about. She was Mary Ann Orlando. And Mary Ann Orlando, like a few of you in this room, I couldn't distinguish as a child whether I was related to her or not, because she was such a consistent and constant part of my life. My father spoke of her as much as he spoke of anyone else. And so if you're a little kid and someone's in your house pretty much every day and occasionally putting you to bed at night and the apple of your dad's eye, you might logically conclude that this person's related to you, even though I was pretty sure we didn't have Italian relatives. But I did know that the issue that was raised in the context of your relationship, Pat, of sisters, that I did learn at an early age that these titles weren't bound by blood definitions, that you could mother without being the mother, you could be an aunt without biological lineage, you could be God-parented without having had the label given to you in a church or a synagogue. And Mary Ann was like a mother to me, honestly. It was only later that I realized that she actually had a job. And on a single day, one of Eunice's long line of revolving assistants, Ayla's here, who was not one of the revolvers, she survived. One of the long line of revolving assistants was calling Roosevelt Greer of the Los Angeles Rams to remind him he was due at Camp Shriver that day, shipping the dog Peter Lawford had left at Timberlawn back to California, wrapping presents for the Shriver children to take to a friend's birthday party, driving Rose Kennedy to the White House for a Rose Garden ceremony, and soothing Ethel the laundress because a black snake had brushed up against her while she was doing the ironing in the basement. That's the house in which Mary Ann created the Peace Corps. The level of energy required, some would say chaos. I guess Dr. English was saying maybe it was chaos from a psychiatrist's point of view. But the level of energy and toughness and perseverance, the level of raw determination to be managing so much under such an extraordinary amount of pressure, but the pressure was brought by the desire. This biographer who sent me this selection was in my office saying she was trying to find more information about the Chicago days and my dad and mom and what they were doing during during the 50s and so on. And I said, have you talked to Mary Ann? And she said, well, no, Mary Ann has declined to speak with me because she doesn't want to, she's not for the public. And so I called Mary Ann and I said, Mary Ann, this biographer is here, Eileen McNamara. Would you be willing to speak to her? She says, well, I've never in my life spoken to anyone about your family. I said, well, this is an authorized biography and we're trying to support this woman. She said, well, if you tell me to, I will, but my number one value has always been loyalty. This was a woman who was loyal to the day she died, to her friends, to her family, to her country, to the missions she embraced, to peace. I mean, what a time we are in today. And where are the Marianne Orlandos? Where are the men and women who will go to work in the government, who will give themselves to these causes and missions, not out of personal egotistical aggrandizement, not out of ideological hatred or vitriol, but simply out of an embrace of the ideals of the country and a willingness to give themselves fully and completely?
I had the pleasure and privilege of meeting Marianne about 8 years ago or so, introduced by Bill, and quickly discovered that, you know, she was a full partner in that amazing group of talented young people that Shriver pulled together, including Bill, to create, you know, this lasting legacy of not just programs that still survive, but values, examples of public service, and methods, strategies that we still try to use, and that we think we discover something new and interesting, and we find that they were there already 40, 50 years ago.
Marianne wanted it to be a luncheon out of joy, not sorrow. So I hope that we can remember that as we spend the last moments together today, that she did not want it to be a mournful, sad, lugubrious day, but in fact a joyful, uplifting day. And I think the speeches that we heard here today very much prove that. Thank you so much.